Good evening, Trump family. Welcome to Open Source News. Have a good night, everyone, and God bless you. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on that notifications bell so you don't miss a thing. Alright, the following is a collection of news from Patriots. Let's get into the news. Stop it. I literally can't take it anymore. And according to The Hill, neither can Democrat leadership. There's buzz going on in DC. The Democrats are indeed beginning to panic, not over the midterms. They know those are lost, no, over 2024. And we're gonna see for ourselves precisely how the Democrats are considering a catastrophic solution to put away Bumbling Bee once and for all. The problem for the Democrats is that they're recognizing that this disaster that looms for the midterms promises to be just a foretaste of the real disaster in 2024. And so this is why Merrill Matthews, a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation, just published a piece in The Hill openly asking the question as to whether leaders in Washington will invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Bee from office. Now, if you don't know, the 25th Amendment provides the protocol for the transference of power whenever a sitting president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, which of course involves transferring that power to the sitting vice president. Oh, my heavens, heaven help us. But more than that, it expressly states that the majority of the president's cabinet, his or her own appointees, must agree to the transfer, so that would require a full-blown Democrat leadership uprising against bumbling Biden. What Matthews is openly surmising here is the chances of that happening are increasing every single day. He lists the obvious reason for it. We frequently see Biden, after he's delivered a speech, wander off as if he doesn't know where he is or where he's supposed to go. Someone hurries over and takes his arm and points him in the right direction. Sometimes, at times, he's lucid and in control, but other times he seems baffled and confused. It's not unusual to see this behavior in older people, and Biden turns 80 this month. And so he goes on to suggest that the pressure to invoke the 25th Amendment on Biden is only going to get worse. Back in March, Tucker Carlson openly called for invoking the 25th against Biden after he openly called for regime change in Russia. So Biden just said, everything that he has said for the last week is true, and none of it has been corrected by people who work for him. The truth is, Joe Biden has no idea. Joe Biden has no idea what his publicists say when he goes to sleep. Then, midway through his answer, Biden starts walking back his own comments. He does that just minutes after saying he would never walk back his own comments. None of that occurred, Biden said. Look, it feels almost like we're being mean to the guy by quoting him, and no one wants that. No one is making fun of his age or his diminished condition, only trying to defend the country. Then moments later, Biden declared that no reasonable person would think he wants regime change in Russia. Watch this if you can stand it, because it's ridiculous. Alright, jokes over. Too much is at stake. Is there was ever a time, if there was in US history ever a time to invoke the 25th Amendment, it is. Now it's Joe Biden himself put it. For God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power. Now, just weeks before that segment, the former physician, to Presidents Trump and Obama, Ronnie Jackson, who's now a representative for the great state of Texas. He spoke on behalf of 40 GOP colleagues who called on Biden to take a cognitive screening exam. So Jackson, as a professional physician, has said overtly that clearly something's not right with Biden. He's clearly exemplifying mental decline and forgetfulness that are only getting worse. And he was clearly mentally unfit for the job of President United States. And again, that was 8 months ago. That was before Biden started getting lost on stage. Now it's obvious to everyone, especially the international media, waiting to see what they have to say about all this. Right now, the international media is openly writing about Biden's obvious cognitive degeneracy. Look at some of these headlines. This is from the British Times. Joe Biden's gaffe fuels claims of cognitive decline, or the British Express. Biden faces fresh fears over cognitive decline after Putin cannot remain in power. Speech. Piers Morgan is openly stating that Biden is obviously showing increased signs of age-related cognitive decline. Obviously, there's a pattern here, and one pattern to notice how quiet our own American legacy media has been with regard to this. They won't even broach the issue, but the genie's out of the bag. And so it's no surprise that the 25th Amendment is being openly considered here. Now, even The Hill is publishing pieces on it. Now it might work out in a very interesting way. in view of the fact that the vast majority of Democrats do not want another Biden term. Word on the street is that there's most likely going to be what Matthews calls a full court press by Democratic leaders to convince Biden not to run for re-election. Now, how successful that effort will be, of course, is anyone's guess. Biden may not concede to that. And so that's where the 25th Amendment comes in. Again, according to Matthews, if Democratic leaders feel Biden isn't up to running again, they could use the 25th Amendment provision as a leverage to get him to agree. In other words, one way or another, Joe. So that's the way the 25th Amendment may be utilized. Here's leverage to get Biden to, at the very least, back out on his own. The 2024 election, of course, we'll have to see, but it is growing increasingly clear. Fewer and fewer people take Biden seriously. That speech last night was beyond cringe. And as Jesse Waters pointed out, it was nothing more than one massive admission that the Democrats are about to lose everything. If they don't want the same thing to happen in 2024, they are absolutely going to have to find someone else to run. And they may have to take drastic steps to ensure just that. And this is some big news. Brazil is exploding. Mass demonstrations are shutting down the nation, as patriots take to the streets in defiance of last weekend's presidential elections. We're going to see precisely what's going on and why Brazil appears to be on the cusp of civil war. You are not going to want to miss this. On Sunday, October 30th, Brazil held their presidential elections, which were a runoff between Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and the former Brazilian President Lula da Silva, who was previously convicted of corruption and serving a jail sentence, and we'll get more into that in a moment. While Lula is a bona fide Marxist, Bolsonaro has been dubbed the tropical Trump. He's a full-blown nationalist populist and the first true conservative to win a Brazilian presidential election back in 2018. In decades, as was to be expected, Brazil's legacy media was shamelessly on the side of Lula's return. They absolutely hate Bolsonaro and predicted that Lula would win the election by upwards of 15 points. It didn't happen. On election day, Lula barely squeaked by winning by just 1 percentage point. Needless to say, patriots didn't buy it. Millions of Brazilians has since taken to the streets in defiance of the outcome of their presidential election over the weekend. The problem in Brazil is that there's simply not an equivalent of an election oversight commission. So the people feel like they have no recourse to challenge perceived election irregularities. But of course, Brazil's got a Supreme Court, don't they? The Supreme Court could certainly intervene in the midst of such a national dispute, can it? That is precisely where things get juicy in Brazilian politics, and explains precisely why Bolsonaro has changed Brazilian politics forever. To really understand what's going on here, there's an excellent piece written by Matt Timmerman that gives the background to what Jair Bolsonaro represents for at least half the Brazilian population. What we have to understand is that in Brazil, it's not so much the president that's been invested, with like supreme powers that were. The president actually is rather limited in terms of his power and influence. In Brazilian politics, the real power resides in Brazil's Supreme Court. The court itself is comprised of 11 justices, and of those 11, 7 were appointed by Lula as well as Dilma Rousseff, who took over after Lula. Only 2 were appointed by Bolsonaro. The court is therefore seen by at least half the nation as a puppet court of Lula. Whatever Lula wants, at least 7 of the 11 judges deliver. And nowhere was that made more evident than the recent overturning of Lula's conviction. Now, if you don't know, the former President Lula was several years back convicted of corruption, was actually a huge scandal, was called Operation Carwash. And it was a corruption scandal which brought down dozens of politicians and business leaders across the country, including Lula, or so we thought, to the shock of millions without any explanation. As I understand it, one of the Supreme Court justices overturned Lula's conviction, simply stating it lacked necessary justification. That in turn freed Lula not just from jail, but to run again as president. So what do you do against a system that's so rigged in favor of a particular political party? But that's precisely where Bolsonaro comes in. And I actually saw this firsthand. Back in 2018, I had the privilege of speaking in Sao Paulo. I spoke at a conference on classical education, and had an absolutely wonderful time there, made many new friends, and it was absolute joy to be there. I was with a lot of conservative Christians, homeschooling families, and everyone was talking about this guy running for president named Jair Bolsonaro. And I remember people saying explicitly, I finally have someone to vote for. I finally have a presidential candidate that represents me and my conservative values. You see, Brazil for the last 4 decades has been absolutely dominated by leftist Marxism. The old joke was every presidential election you had in their runoff, you had a choice between either a Marxist candidate or a leftist candidate. But scholars have noticed that over the last decade, Brazilians were very clearly turning more and more to a reawakened political right in their national local politics. An article written right around that time in the Wall Street Journal recognized that Brazil was seeing nothing less than a conservative renaissance going on throughout the various sectors of their society, which had been brewing under the radar for the last 15 years or so. One of the great honors of my life was getting to know and interviewing the great Brazilian philosopher and political theorist, a lover to Carvalho, God rest his soul. He's credited as being in effect Bolsonaro as philosopher, and he laid the groundwork over the last few decades, through his writings, and his YT channel for the rise of a thoroughly thought intellectually coherent Brazilian Christian conservatism, that greatly influenced the politics of Jair Bolsonaro. And so when Bolsonaro came on the scene in 2018, he was viewed as a true alternative to this corrupt leftist system, this alliance between the Supreme Court and the Workers' Party. For example, one of the biggest problems plaguing Brazil is their violent crime, which Lula, like BLM, advocates here in the States, Lula allowed to run rampant. Lula, in many respects, is seen as the champion of drug cartels in Brazil, because they're so embedded in the poverty-stricken regions that he supposedly champions and represent. But when Bolsonaro came on the scene, he promised those days were over. He was going to crush violent crime, which, by the way, he largely did. This is one of the reasons why Bolsonaro was so popular in Brazil. Homicide rates dropped by an astonishing 20% in 2019. It represented the lowest murder rate in over a decade since 2007. Bolsonaro took measures to boost the police force around the nation. He gave policemen basically free rein to take out hardcore drug cartel leaders and violent offenders. He increased the number of military snipers in the police force. He made it easier for citizens to purchase legal firearms to protect themselves and their families. And as a result, violent crime dropped dramatically under Bolsonaro's tenure. Bolsonaro was the symbol of the Brazilian patriot resistance against their permanent Marxist political class. And now, those patriots who are clearly at least half the country, they believe that the election was problematic to say the least, especially given the unexplained reversal of Lula's conviction. And the people have decided, you know what, we've had it. They've had it with Lulu, they've had it with the Supreme Court there. They've had it with the drug cartels getting coddled by the Marxist Workers' Party, and they are pushing back, and they're pushing back in numbers we've never seen. They're demonstrating in the streets, they're rising up and making it absolutely clear that the days of corrupt socialist forces dominating the people of Brazil are over. Now, where this goes is anyone's guess. Bolsonaro is technically not conceded as of yet. So we'll obviously be keeping a very close eye on things, but there is absolutely no question Bolsonaro has awakened a sleeping giant in Brazilian politics, and Brazil will never be the same. Thank you very much. WWG1WGA. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button to watch the next episode.